On Monday, the 27th of April, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute released its annual report on global military expenditure. The headline under 2.88 trillion United States dollars in 2025, a 2.9% real terms increase and the 11th consecutive year of growth. The world's military burden, defense spending as a share of global GDP, reached 2.5%, the highest level since 2009. European spending rose by 14% year on year to $864 billion, the sharpest annual rise in Central and Western Europe since the end of the Cold War. Germany at $114 billion became Europe's largest spender. Russian spending grew 5.9% to $190 billion. Asia spent $681 billion, an 8.1% rise. Saudi Arabia, the largest Middle Eastern spender, reached $83.2 billion. American spending in 2025 fell 7.5% to $944 billion, primarily because no new Ukraine assistance was approved. But congressional approval for fiscal year 2026 has crossed $1 trillion. President Trump has proposed $1.5 trillion for 2027. And in the first quarter of 2026 alone, the United States approved over $45 billion in foreign military sales, 81% of which, more than $36.6 billion, went to the Middle Eastern partners. The story in the Stockholm's data is not about any one country. It is about the architecture of the world described by the data. 2.4% of global GDP on militaries, the highest share since 2009. 11 straight years of increase. Europe up 14% in a single year. Asia up 8%. The US dropped in 2025 only because the Ukraine money paused. It rises again to over $1 trillion in 2026. We are looking at a structural rearmament of the international system. The scale is the largest since the late 1980s. And here is the analytical point. Rearmament at this scale is not a response to a single war. It is a response to the loss of confidence in the architecture that made rearmament unnecessary. Peace. The European spending surge is not really about Ukraine. It is about Europe losing confidence in the American security guarantees. The Asian surge is really not about China. It is about Asian middle powers, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, concluding they may, in the next decade, be alone. The Middle Eastern surge is about Gulf monarchies pricing in the chance that the next American administration may not arrive when called. So, what is being financed, in other words, is the world after the American security guarantee. The Patriots, Saudi Arabia is buying, the F-35s, Greece is buying, the German submarines, the Polish tanks, the South Korean fighter jets are all the inventories of an international system that no longer trusts its own structure to keep the peace. It is buying at record cost, at the means to keep the peace itself. And here is the point that connects to the first two stories that we discussed. The Iran war is not in this data an outlier. It is an accelerant. Lockheed Martin is scaling Patriot Pact 3 production from 620 missiles a year to 2,000 by 2032. The American defense industrial base is in surge production. That is not a posture you adopt for a war you expect to end in 30 days. That is the posture of an industrial base preparing for a decade of demand. Now, the question I want to discuss with our guest is that who pays for this in the structural sense? Every dollar of 2.88 trillion is a dollar not being spent on health, on education, on the energy transition. We are choosing collectively to spend the marginal dollar on weapons rather than on the things the same governments tell their citizens are urgent. That is a civilizational choice, and it is being made year after year with very little public debate. To discuss this, we have a very seasoned journalist with us, Mubashir Zaidi. Thank you so much, Mubashir, for joining us. I was looking at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that released its annual report yesterday. It says there is a major surge in global military spending, almost $2.88 trillion in 2025, and it is the 11th straight year of this increase. So, what we are looking at is not one country or not one war. It is the whole international system that is rearming itself all at the same time. So, I want to take your take on that. Is this temporary surge which ends when Ukraine or Iran war ends, or is it a structural shift, a rearmament cycle that once it begins takes a generation to reverse?
Well, thank you so much, Zunaira, for having me. I believe that we have actually entered a new era where wars will not end in days or months. We did it once with India. That was quite a feat. But if you see, the Ukraine war has entered its fifth year. Gaza war lasted for 2 years, despite the fact that it was a genocide by Israel, and civilian Palestinians have no way to defend themselves. Still, it went on for 2 years. The Lebanon war went for about a year, and then there's a temporary ceasefire, but still fighting is going on. So we are in an era where wars are taking longer than the traditional wars that used to happen. And if you look at the Iran US conflict, it is also getting a prolonged entering a prolonged era, because Iranians were prepared to take it to fight it with the US and Israel for a longer period of time. So that is why I think more majority of the countries are now looking at increasing their military spending with whatever's happening around the globe. The international order has collapsed. There is no jurisdiction of the United Nations now accepted by anyone, any country, because we've seen countries going without international authorization or with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. So basically, now every country is on itself, which means that they have to boost up their military spending. We've seen this happening with Europe now. They had been cutting their defense expenditure for long, like Germany or France for that matter, but now they are spending more on defense. Same goes for other countries as well, because they know that this is an era where they will not be saved by a bloc or an international organization like the UN. So that is why everyone is boosting their military expenditure, and we will see it continue to happen.
You're spot on what you said about the European numbers, because according to this report, the European number is 14% year on year, and Germany alone is at $114 billion. It has crossed like 2% of the GDP for the first time since 1990. Is this Europe, if we specifically talk about Europe, finally taking responsibility for its own security after 80 years of American underwriting, or is this Europe being forced into this posture by the US?
Well, I think it's both. Because the wars, the way it have gone on for years, particularly the Ukraine and Russia war, so that has prompted Europe to redraw its strategy. And now with the US President Trump totally neglecting NATO, the alliance that was used to be the alliance to impose whatever war decisions on international front were to happen. Now NATO has more or less collapsed as well. Trump has said time and again that Europe and NATO are on their own, and he would not like to support NATO anymore, although it is still part of NATO. But practically, all the funding, all the support that NATO used to get it from the US has now ended. So, which means that Europe has to take care of its own defense. And with Russian aggression or Russian threat, as they call it, is on their doorsteps, I think Europe, that prompted the reason for Europe to spend its increase in defense expenditure. But it's not just Europe. You've seen our next door neighbor, India, has been spending a lot.
Yeah.
You've Saudi Arabia spending a lot. So it's all over. As the international order, world order has collapsed, we and a new order hasn't shaped up yet. So in the meantime, all the countries are bolstering their defense expenditure to make sure that they can, fight any threat, any external aggression.
Let's bring Middle East and the Situation Room in. $45 billion in American foreign military sales in the first quarter, 81% to the Middle East. Lockheed and RTX scaling Patriot production from 620 missiles and a year to 2,000 by 2032. Does that production schedule create a domestic political constituency inside the US as well? Because there are two things which are really interesting to note, that there are gas prices rising and the war is not very popular, but at the same time the defense spending is becoming all-time high. Where is this going in your opinion?
Well, that's a typical US war machine. They have been doing it in the past and they're doing it now as well. They create a war, then fund it, and then sell their weapons to the countries. It's a classical US strategy. So for now, we've seen Trump not getting any challenge locally for now, because he has majority in both Senate and the Congress. In Congress, it may be a thin majority, but still we have seen attempts to stop the war being thwarted with a majority, which means that the US establishment is controlling things. They are selling weapons, and now after the Iran war, you will see sale of more US weapons to countries in the Gulf, to countries in Europe maybe, and in our neighborhood, to India, or even to Japan and South Korea. So this is what is happening right now. Things are becoming more clearer, but US for now has no internal threat in terms of, if you're saying that President Trump may face
Mubashir,
any
let
sort
me
of
interject here, if I may. And you rightly said that this is a typical and classic American playbook. But do you think there is going to be a point where this might get tested by the voters, by the Congress?
Well, it is being tested. You've seen traditional allies of the US, like Europe, not agreeing to be part of this war. So which means dynamics are changing, because US has imposed this war on Iran on the behest of Israel. So for now, Europe is not supporting this war. And even in Far East Asia, if you see Japan or South Korea, they are not willing to support US on that. Excuse me. So this is a new trend that is emerging. So US, yes, it may be an unpopular war as per polls in the US, but for now, I think US is not facing any such threat internally or externally by any bloc or a country to stop this war.
Right. Let's talk a bit about Global South, the countries that yesterday Tehran was appealing to in the St. Petersburg. These are the countries which have the slowest defense spending growth and the smallest defense industries, because they cannot rearm at the European or Asian pace. And structurally, these are the consumers of a security architecture that they did not design. How might they respond to this rearmament trend?
Well, I think they will rearm themselves. We've already seen orders being placed from our immediate neighborhood to Europe and to Israel, to US. So you will see. But in Far East, things will move towards China to get the latest equipment. But surely countries who were previously cutting their defense expenditure and not buying weapons will now start to arm themselves to an extent that they will guard against any external threat. So that is the new phenomena emerging, and not a lot has been written about it, not a lot has been talked about it, except for the the research that you've quoted. So things are slowly coming to light about how the world is emerging now and how external threats are increasing, and that is forcing countries to increase their defense budgets.
Mubashir Zaidi, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure having you on our show.
Likewise.
So tonight we did 3 stories. A Russian president in St. Petersburg telling an Iranian foreign minister on camera that the entire world admires the Iranian people. And Tehran in real time building the coalition of consequences this war has produced. An American president in the Situation Room choosing between a deal that ends the war on terms he did not set and a continuation that costs him $1 billion a day. And a global arms ledger from Stockholm, $2.88 trillion, the 11th straight year of increase, the financial signature of a world that no longer trusts the architecture that was supposed to make the spending unnecessary. So if there is a single finding tonight, it is this: we are not any longer watching a war between 2 states. We are watching the instrument by which the international system itself is being reorganized. The question is not who wins the Iran war. The question is what the world would look like on the day after it ends and how it ends. The room in St. Petersburg is closed. The room in Islamabad remains open. The room in Washington has a clock on its wall. I am Zunaira Azhar, and this was DECODE. Good night.